Good evening, folks, and welcome to TalkSports, our midweek program where we chat with the movers and shakers in sports, the sportsmen, the sportswomen, as well as the administrators past and present. Well, on this evening's program, we'll be looking at a very special topic, a topic that may seem just on the surface as just minor, but we believe when we discuss it, we'll realize it's actually a major topic. It has to do with the whole issue of physical inactivity thereof, lack of physical activity. So physical inactivity and the severe outcomes, that's COVID-19 outcomes. And it is very important to understand that in this pandemic, the limitations to an extent, especially in the Caribbean, and how it may as well as will impact our fight against the pandemic and development in going forward. Well, a very special guest is with us this evening, and let me introduce my guest, who actually is a lecturer in sociology at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine Campus. Let me introduce to us Dr. Anand Rampersad, who is all the way in Hoover in Trinidad. Good evening to you, Dr. Rampersad.
Good evening, Michael, and thank you very much for having me on your program.
Yes, Doc, as I indicated in the introduction, that the whole issue of physical inactivity and severe COVID-19 outcomes, and something you related to in your most recent column in the Trinidad Guardian. In fact, Dr. Rampersad has a weekly column, for you folks wondering, in the Trinidad Guardian, under the column sportification. What a name, sportification, yeah. But a very important issue, and it relates to physical inactivity and the severe COVID-19 outcomes. Doc, first of all, I want to ask you, why do you see such an issue, such a topic as very, very important?
Okay. Well, I've been looking at the whole issue of physical activity pre-COVID and the importance of physical activity in terms of dealing on providing a space to address physical attributes that persons may exhibit. Also, in terms of social benefits, also in terms of psychological benefits, as well as in terms of dealing with diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, what the benefits of engaging in physical activity provides. And when you look at the studies, they all show that engaging in physical activity, whether it's light, moderate, or intense, provides numerous benefits to individuals, as I indicated early on. And so physical activity not only assists individuals in dealing with their own personal development, but it can also translate into community benefits as well as a societal benefits, because a healthy population means that governments will have to spend less on health. And when you live in developing countries like us in the Caribbean, and healthcare accounts for a large segment of the population, the budget. And with the aging population as well, you want to have a population that is more or less healthy across the board. And it does not only translate in terms of individual health, but it benefits the society in terms of having less people staying home from work. So that's a positive as well. And overall, a healthy society is beneficial. And if we look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, 2015 to 2030, you would see a number of them relates to health in directly or indirectly. So by being able to have a healthy society, a physically active society, and by extension, not a society that is physically inactive, it has multiple benefits for the individuals, communities, and the overall society moving forward. So I see focusing on physical activity as being very important in the overall holistic development of all societies within the Caribbean.
Mhm. Well, yeah, I was about to ask you specifically with the Caribbean, and as indicated, you're in Trinidad and Tobago, and Trinidad basically is in a lockdown, and
Yes.
so how do you see that what you're saying there, relates to your situation in Trinidad, where physical activity is somewhat limited?
Well, let me address this by from personal perspective. In fact, since the start of COVID-19 and the measures to stay-at-home measures, social distancing, especially since the start of the year, I have been engaging in physical activity on a daily basis where I set out to run at least 10 kilometers every day. And this has become part of my activities on a daily basis. And then on Monday, we have been put on a state of emergency. And one of the measures is that there will be no outdoor activities. And since Monday to today, it's a struggle to make that adjustment because when it's at 4 o'clock, I go out to run and I am out from between 4 to 7 or thereabout. But it's not just the physical activity, it's also the social engagement. You meet people, you chat with them. I mean, you keep within the measures that have been outlined by the state. But it's not just the physical aspect of it, it's the psychological benefits. You raise the endorphin levels, it put you on a high, and then suddenly we have had this lockdown, and given the current situation, the state has no other choice but to do it. And for those persons who have been heavily involved in physical activity, it's almost like a withdrawal effect, and it is going to be a struggle for us. I mean, as I said, it's a struggle for me just to make the change, and it's only 3 days into the SOE. And I can see that for persons who are involved in physical activity, making that change will call upon them to find creative ways to remain physically active. On the other hand, persons who are not generally engaged in physical activity, what we may call physical inactivity, my concern is that the level of physical inactivity may also increase, um, and be reinforced by binge eating, for instance. So, for instance, you may find persons making up time by engaging in eating, or using other creative ways to survive. Cooking becomes a creative way, but cooking then translates into eating and becoming couch potatoes and then snacking. And I have a major concern among children because not just the psychological effect of the lockdown, but how do they buy time? And that physical inactivity is something that it's going to be compounded. So it's affecting us in two ways. One, those who are physically active, and that cold turkey approach now where you have to withdraw from what you're accustomed doing. And on the other hand, those who are physically inactive, may engage in activities that may just reinforce their physical inactivity and also create new challenges. Question of putting on weight. It is quite easy to put on weight in a period like this. And that's one of my major concerns.
Mhm. And there is also, Doc, there's also the belief that when you talk about physical activity, that people believe you're referring just to sports.
Yes.
There is this, so you know, physical activity. Okay, it means running. It means getting onto a track. These sort of
Yes.
things like that. So, but in layman's terms, if someone listening, how do you define to them physical activity in the context that you're referring to?
Physical activity would be movement, keeping the body mobile, increasing the heart rate when we are moving about, walking up the stairs, for instance. Simple things such as, if you are working in a building, instead of using the elevator, it's advised you use the stairs. You increase the heart rate. It involves movement. You keep the muscles, the body moving. So physical activity, it can be at home, doing work at home. So for instance, if you have a kitchen garden, spending time there. It involves physical movement, it involves sweating, and so that is beneficial as well. So I think with the lockdown, we have to find creative ways to be physically active at home and not just become couch potatoes and the problems that can come with that.
Mhm. And you made reference in your article to the SALIS, is it the SALIS study?
Yes.
Right. And in addition to that, you asked that the chief medical officer, or the team within the Ministry of Health in Trinidad and Tobago, provide what you saw were insights into that study by Salis et al. 2021, and as it regards to the physical activity, physical inactivity. And I want to zone in on your situation in Trinidad and Tobago. Give us some clarity as to why you think that the chief medical officer or the chief medical officer or the Ministry of Health should do likewise.
Right. When I looked at the study points to, and I don't know if I may give a summary of the study so that, and then I could build on it. So basically, the study is published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and it was a study of 48,440 adults who were diagnosed with COVID between January 1st, 2020 and October 21st, 2020. And what this study, the researchers found, and I'm just going to state exactly what they found, is that patients who were consistently inactive during the 2 years preceding the pandemic, so they're looking at pre-2020, were more likely to be hospitalized, admitted to intensive care unit, and die than patients who were consistently meeting physical active guidelines. So in a sense, what they're saying there is that by being physically active, it would have improved one's immune system and would have given these patients a greater chance of fighting the virus as opposed to someone who may be physically inactive and by extension may suffer from NCDs such as obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, etc. And so what this study is showing is that from the data that persons who were more active were least likely to be hospitalized or least likely to be in ICU and were least likely to die. Now, this does not mean that once you were physically active, that's what's going to happen. But the data pointed in that direction. And so they also found that meeting US physical activity guidelines was associated with substantial benefit. But even those doing some physical activity had lower risk for severe COVID-19 outcomes, including death, than those who were consistently inactive. So even if you engage in some aspect of physical activity, it increased your chances of resisting the virus. So that was the three main findings from the study. And I found that very interesting because pre-COVID, I've always advocated the importance of physical activity, not only because from a researcher's point of view, but from my personal life as well. As I said, I try as much as possible to be physically active. And so I wanted to see that whether or not that if we were physically active in terms of our immune system, the health of our body, might give us a little more leverage, a little more time in addressing or fighting the virus. And it's in this context, I wrote that, it would be interesting to find out from our chief medical officer, what's their take on this? And also, will they think that it is useful, assuming we did not have a state of emergency, to encourage people to engage in physical activity, of course, within the social distancing guidelines of ensuring we wear masks and maintaining that distance between each other. Whether or not they would encourage the general public to become more physically active than we are normally. Unfortunately, the state of emergency doesn't allow for that at this point in time. It's a difficult situation. And I think we have to do all that is necessary to minimize the transmission of the virus.
Mhm. Doc, are you concerned that if action is not taken soon, that the post-pandemic period in the Caribbean will have to deal with other health and social issues, and how sports and physical education could probably stem that sort of concern?
Okay, there have been a number of reports, and I'll speak to first Trinidad and Tobago, where studies done here have pointed to the fact that there is a growing case of obesity among the population, and they have found the level has increased among women, but they have also found an increase among children. And also, there have been a study done in Latin America and the Caribbean, which also point to a major concern. And I think I pointed it out in the article as well. And I'm just, well, so according to WHO, 23% of adults and 81% of adolescents, this is in a general context, are not involved in physical activity. Um, yes, there was an IDB report that looked at the level of physical activity in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what they found was that there was a high percentage of persons who were physically inactive. And this raised a lot of alarm bells, especially when we look at non communicable diseases, diabetes, hypertension, um, being two major factors. And the fact that we are seeing more persons being diagnosed with these at earlier ages, it creates a bigger picture and creates a bigger problem later on. It creates a problem at the individual level, at the family level. It creates a problem at the societal level where the state will be burdened with additional cost in order to provide healthcare for the general public. So it's important that post-pandemic that we take a very strategic and structured approach to address the issue of physical activity, starting with the the school system, starting with ensuring that sport and physical education is an integral part in the lives of children. Also ensuring that families get involved in physical activity. Also, it involves the private sector as well. You need the Ministry of Health, and you also need the various ministries of sport. And so, if we can create a framework where we promote physical activity, leisure activities, I think we will be moving in the right direction. We are tropical countries. We have a benefit of living more outdoors than indoors, and we really have to cash in on this. You know, it doesn't always have to be competitive activities. It could be competitive, but for fun. So if we could get fun in it, I think it can go a long way to ensuring that a large segment of our population across all age groups. You know, we don't want to focus solely on children or the young population. We want to make sure we cover the working population, the elderly. We have to appreciate that we are aging population. And so how do we address the issue as with an aging population? How do we create environments so that as we age, we also continue to involve ourselves in sport and physical activity? Do we have the infrastructure, the recreational grounds, the facilities? How do we get sports clubs involved in it? And so we need a holistic plan to ensure that we make physical activity part of our culture. And once we can do that, it's going to be a work in progress. I think we will be moving in the right direction.
Doc, but there is the argument also that all these reports and findings, you know, from these international, well, and even some of those regional agencies, but do you think that governments should move beyond just issuing statements, and the time is for action. The time now is for action.
Yes, I agree with you fully, and we I think what we need is um, multiple stakeholders working together. So we don't rely solely on the state. You know, you get the state is there through their ministries of sport. You get the private sector as well. You get the researchers involved as well. Ministry of Health, Education, Community Development, and you are then able to have a holistic, multidisciplinary approach to addressing this issue of physical activity. And I think that is the direction we ought to be going. You see, we all have to see ourselves as being responsible. So, for instance, this program is reflecting that. It's because you would have noticed or observed that this is something we need to talk about. So we have a conversation about it. You have persons listening to it. So this is all part of the process. You know, the communication, the sensitizing, the raising of awareness, and then that can trickle down into various types of action. You have the support of the state, but you also have the support of sporting organizations. So you have, for instance, different sporting organizations in every country in the region. You have football, you have cricket, you have basketball, you have netball, you have athletics, to name a few. They all have a responsibility for the development of sport and also seeing sport for development, and not just about competing specifically in their sport, but also seeing it as a means to build that sense of community. And so I think this is the approach we need, not just depending solely on the state, but getting all the various stakeholders on board. And I think this is where we can move forward. And one of the things, Michael, that I really think that we are lacking in the Caribbean is the lack of data. We need the research to be done. For instance, how many studies do we have that points out exactly why we may, as a region and as each island, what factors affect engagement in physical activity at different demographics, whether it's based on age, gender, geographical location. Do we have those data? It is only through data then we can also take action. So we don't want to be jumping into something that we're only speculating what could be the problem. We need to be doing research. We need to be doing ongoing research. And through the research, it will then inform decision making, which can then lead to the kind of results we want. Because if we want to meet these sustainable development goals, how are we going to measure it? We have to come up with data and say that from 2022 to 2030, in 2022, we had X amount of persons engage in 30 minutes of physical activity 3 times a week across different demographics. By 2025, we saw an increase, and then we could explain what is accounting for that, or we saw a decrease. It is only through data as well that we can be able to make better decisions as opposed to speculating what could be done or what should be done.
Well, my next question had to do with the whole issue of the Sustainable Development Goals and whether or not you think the Caribbean is on target for 2030. Do you?
I would definitely think that, especially with the current pandemic, it's going to reverse whatever developments or progress we would have made or would have stunted it. And so I think it will take us a little while to really get back on track and as to the direction we want to go, because the uncertainty of the pandemic, we don't know exactly. We don't have a timeline to say, well, okay, we can return to quote unquote normalcy within 5 months, the end of the year. And a lot of this has to do with the availability of the vaccines. I think if we had that certainty of getting vaccines and being able to vaccinate our population, we might then be in a position like the US and many European countries to start timelines for reopening and getting back to some level of normalcy. I think, given the current situation in the Caribbean at this point in time, it will be difficult to really foresee where we are in a year's time without the vaccines. And it will be very tough upon the state to be able to achieve some of these goals because of this.
You said, and it's also the time for many stakeholders to be on board, and it's not
Yes.
just a responsibility of the state. Who are some of the stakeholders that you think should be part of this process? This sporting communities, community groups. Who do you think, if you can expand some of
Yeah.
the stakeholders?
Well, okay. So I am thinking that you have the ministries of sport, you have Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education. So at the government level, those three bodies, the sporting organizations themselves, whether it's the Cricket Association, the Football Association, the Olympic Association, I think the heads of all of these associations have a responsibility. The business community as well has a role to play, and very creative ways sponsoring events. One of the things I was thinking about, what I've seen in the last couple of years in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm sure it's throughout the region as well, is how we have been able to marry physical activity and breast cancer awareness. And in October, there is a number of fun walks, runs, and you see a lot of the business members of the business community sponsoring events. And so they have been able to marry sport with business and also with an important issue of breast cancer. And I'm thinking this is the kind of creative ways that, yes, you will have the competitive athletes who will come out to win the medals, but for others, you want to promote it that just participating is winning, while at the same time, you are addressing an important health issue, such as breast cancer or prostate cancer, as the case may be. We also have ways we can do this. Where we can use sporting events to tie it in with carnival, with tourism, with sea activities. It doesn't have to be the traditional sports. We have to look at adventure activities, hiking, different activities, and you bring all these various stakeholders. I think this is where the business community is important because they bring their strategic thinking into the process. You also have NGOs, and you have community organizations as well. So I think if you get a good mix of various stakeholders, the benefits of it, I think, will definitely be great in terms of achieving this idea of getting people more physically active.
Docs, recent sporting events and major sporting events moved away from Trinidad and Tobago. Do you think it was the right thing to do?
Oh, yes, I definitely think that it was the best decision. We would have seen just recently the South African tour, which was scheduled for Trinidad and Tobago, being shifted to St. Lucia. And I think it was the best decision. And I'll tell you why I think it was the best decision because from a national point of view, we have a current surge in COVID cases. There's a lot of pressure on the parallel health system. And you do not want to take a further responsibility by bringing in athletes, not just the athlete support staff and other officials. And you do not want to you also have to cater for them in case something goes wrong. And you don't want to have a situation where you're unable to do that. And secondly, from a national point of view, you do not want nationals to be looking at the situation and saying, we are treating with the athletes, the foreign persons, and we're not treating with our own people. So I think the state, the government, if they would have made that decision, or if it was Cricket West Indies, that was the best decision. And I think we should have learned from India as well. We saw what was happening in India. Well, a lot of questions being asked. Why are we having the IPL? And look what is happening in the the wider spectrum of India. And then we saw that even in that biosecure arrangement that was supposed to be to protect the players, they themselves started to be infected, and eventually they had to postpone the COVID, the IPL to a later date. And I think that we made the best decision. At this point in time, we want to protect everyone. We want to protect our nationals. And also we want to protect, if we bring people here, we want to make sure that we should protect them because our image is at stake, not just Trinidad and Tobago, but it would have been the Caribbean image at stake, and we don't want a bad image going out there.
Well, just a bit off topic as well, Doc. The way things are going, it appears that Trinis will have to do without Carnival probably for a second year. Do you think so?
Well, yeah, if we are unable to stem the increase, if it continues as it is, there's no other choice but to do that. Just today, the Minister of Education announced that they are pushing back the C exam, the secondary entrance exam, to July the 1st, because they want to make sure that the health of the children and teachers take precedent. Although the exam is important, but the health of children and the teachers who would be involved in it should take precedent. So they have pushed back the exam until the 1st of July with the hope that between now and then we would start seeing the numbers decreasing, and that should then augur well for the students come July the 1st. So I think at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we protect lives at all costs.
Okay. Doc, last week I had the chairman of the Grenada Tourism Authority, Barry Collymore, on our program, and he made some very interesting statements and comments, one of which I want to play for you to hear, and then you will comment on it. But it has to do with the heavy, what he referred to as the heavy reliance on liming and alcohol as avenues of leisure. And he gave that as possible reasons. He's no doctor, but he says possible reasons why he believes that some islands are experiencing a spike in COVID cases. Just listen to Barry Collymore and we'll come back to comment on it.
Sure.
And this may be a little bit controversial, but I feel that as well that in a sense, the way that we socialize in the Caribbean, or the way that we are beginning to, the heavy reliance on liming and alcohol as our avenues of leisure is probably one of the reasons why some places are having a harder time with the pandemic than others, because we have forgotten some of the traditional ways in which we socialize through sport, and people aren't playing as much sport as they used to. Men will spend a whole day on the block lining, and I'm not condemning anyone or saying that that's a bad thing. But when you look at our incidence of non-communicable diseases, high rates of hypertension and diabetes, it's because we have become too sedentary. And you and I know, Michael, when you watch as a kid, when you watch the West Indies on TV, if you're fortunate to have a TV or you watch it by your neighbor, and the game ends, especially when the West Indies, like, the first thing you do is you go out in the road and you play cricket with the boys, or you because that example is there. I think that we have to. Sport is not just in terms of sports tourism. It's not just about the visitor. It's also about us and keeping our populations healthy and setting an example for future generations. We have an opportunity now through sport, through leisure, because of our record, stellar record in most places in the Caribbean of managing the pandemic, to use sport and leisure as an add-on, as an adjunct, and as a catalyst, and indeed a great marketing vehicle to get people who would not normally come to the Caribbean to come to the Caribbean.
Doc, Barry Collymore is no doctor, but he's no scientist. But I'm getting the feeling that he's somewhere along your thought pattern. What do you want to say about what Barry said, and what do you want to add to what Barry said?
Well, I think what Barry is saying is spot on as well. That the thing about it is that when we speak about liming in the Caribbean, what does that mean? When we gather together, it involves music, food, and alcohol wherever we go, whether it's at the beach, whether it's watching a football game, a cricket match, wherever they go by the river, we assemble by someone's home. We go to the sports bar to look at the finals of football, cricket, Olympics. We have Olympics coming up in a couple of weeks' time. Unfortunately, we wouldn't more than likely not be able to look at it in the way we have. You normally find that that's the leisure part of it. You play all fours, you play different games, and you find that in the Caribbean that we use food, alcohol, and music. They go hand in hand, and they almost reinforce each other. When you listen to some of the calypsos, it's a reinforcement of each other. So that is one aspect of it. When we talk about leisure activities, as he said, the add-ons, the adjunct to what happens on the park or what happens on the court, they almost go hand in hand. And even some of the athletes themselves, I mean, especially if they're not the elite athletes, after they play, the community player, the player in the village, after they finish, they also participate in it. So it is part and parcel of the way we celebrate life in the Caribbean. And it's how you look at it, whether it's a plus or a negative. Now, there are side effects to that, and as he mentioned the issue of hypertension, diabetes, which comes with some of it hereditary, some of it by the type of foods we eat, the ingredients we use in our food, they reinforce that. So leisure activities definitely involves these alcohol and etc. But at the same time, it also supports the sport. When you go to a World Cup qualifier, you go to cricket. I remember going to the Oval, and you would see people carrying the cooler, and you're sure it's not water they're carrying inside there. That's less water to what else they're carrying. You go to the beach. You may play some cricket or football on the beach, but you also are consuming. And that is just a reality of our lives. Alcohol has become very commercialized as well. You find alcohol companies sponsoring sporting events. They're involved in it. It is sold at the events as well. So it's almost difficult to separate it. We're going to watch the Champions League final next week. One of the major sponsors is Heineken. Right, and during that period of advertising the Champions League, you are also going to be advertising the beer, which is the sponsor of the event. So it's almost difficult in the modern period to separate the two. On one hand, but on the other hand is how do we manage it? How do we manage it so that we can get the best of both worlds? I think that's the major challenge.
Okay, and speaking about the Olympics, are you, and someone who's following sports and global sports to an extent, are you hopeful that the Olympics at this stage, the Olympics will go ahead? And if you have to advise Caribbean countries, would you advise them to proceed with their participation in the Olympic Games?
I would say that I'm interested in what is the unfolding of this of the Olympics. I have been following some of the news coming out of Japan, and I must say just this morning I was looking at CTGN, and it was pointing out that there is some element of resistance within the Japanese societies with regard to hosting the Olympics. There's a concern about the vaccination rates in Japan compared to other countries. The concern that focus will be placed on the athletes. I know the IOC is working towards vaccinating all athletes. There's a question about medical care, and I think I heard this morning where it was indicated that if need be, they will get medical persons to be brought into Japan to cater for the Olympics. On the other hand, I think that once the IOC and the local organizing committee can guarantee that our athletes, and not just Caribbean athletes, but all athletes, officials, will be provided with an environment in which they can be comfortable enough to participate and not, have to fear of contracting the virus. I would support the event to that extent, because a lot of these athletes have been training for a long period of time. They put off from 2020. They're also aging as well. So we don't want to deprive them that opportunity. But I really would like to see that all is done to ensure that the environment is conducive. And I think, Michael, one of the things that we all have to accept, and even us in the Caribbean, that COVID-19 is going to be with us even when we vaccinate. As scientists are learning about the virus is mutating. So the virus is going to be with us. There is going to be some level of cases in every country. I was telling someone today that I think we will be foolhardy to think in Trinidad and Tobago that we have to wait until we reach 0 cases. If you watch at many countries who have started to reopen, there are thousands of cases every day. Although they are reopening, and it's almost as accepting the fact that you will have a number of cases in every society. And that is something we'll have to live with until we can come up with a foolproof vaccine, whether it's injection, or I was reading this morning that there's work on a nasal vaccine, which will be sprayed into the nose, and which can help in prevention of the spread of the virus into the body. But for now, I think it's something that we have to accept. And it is in this context I am saying that, the event at the Olympics, once that environment can be provided to guarantee the safety of all athletes, including ours in the Caribbean, all officials, etc., I think that the event should go on.
And at what stage do you think, in terms of the reopening, because Trinidad and Jamaica, for example, had open, close, reopen, that whole back and forth. At what stage do you think there should be some level of comfort in terms of reopening? And you touch on an important point about there won't be any 0 cases. New York, for example, there's still deaths, there's still positive cases, but there's already phased reopening. At what stage do you think the Caribbean should look at reopening?
Michael, I would say that the key to that is vaccination. I think once we in the Caribbean are able to vaccinate, let's say it is said herd immunity should be between 70 to 80%. The faster we can get to 70 to 80% of vaccination of the population, I think we would be in good stead. And I think once we have started to vaccinate, I don't think we have to reach to 70 or 80% then to open fully or to start opening. We can phase in our opening once we start vaccinating. And so once we are able to access the vaccines and we start vaccinating the population, I think we will then be in a position to engage in phase opening with a great degree of comfort, and of course maintaining all the necessary measures that has to go with it. And I think that is the direction that we need to go. And it sort of reinforces the world. If we look at United States, we look at European countries, they are in their position now because they have been able to vaccinate. And we are in a situation where we have the surges, but we just don't have the vaccine to be able to vaccinate our population. And if I may say one other thing on that, once you have increases in the numbers, it also puts pressure on the medical system. And this is where the vaccine comes in, because if we could ensure that people do not hospitalize, and if we go back to the study, if it is true that physically active people are more likely to resist, it means less people will enter in the hospitals, and this is what we want. You don't want people in ICU. ICU is a bad signal, whether we like it or not. It points in one direction. And when I look at the numbers every day, before I end looking at the numbers, I look to see the numbers in ICU, and I also look to see the numbers in HDU. And yesterday it was 62 persons in HDU. We had 50 persons in HDU and 12 in ICU. Today it dropped to 40 overall. We now have 25 in HDU, and we now have 15 in ICU. So although the numbers have dropped, my concern is the 15 that have now gone to ICU. And so, yeah, I mean, this is why I say strongly that vaccination is the key. Once we can vaccinate, it now gives us that leverage, and we in the Caribbean need that, because, our monocrop type societies, heavy dependency on tourism throughout the region. A lot of the countries are dependent on tourism. And, once we are vaccinated, then we can be with a great degree of security, allow persons to enter and, reap the benefit of that, but also protect our people at the same time.
Doc, as a sociologist, how concerned are you regarding the Caribbean countries and the post-pandemic period? The focus obviously will be on health as probably a number one priority. And when it comes to local budgets, for example, health obviously will be getting the big chunk. How do you see other sectors and other important sectors of the economy being affected? And when we say sectors, sometimes people don't look as mental health, for example, as an issue. We just look at health in terms of the medical aspect of it, But coming out of the pandemic period, things like mental health will be an issue. As a sociologist, what are some of the areas you believe that governments, regional governments, should be focusing on to ensure that there is more balance in terms with your economic recovery as well as the development of society?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think a lot of the focus will be on economic recovery, but economic recovery has to be balanced with other areas. In terms of education, I think we also have to tie in what you are saying, education with mental health. We want to make sure that one of the downsides of online learning, and when you speak to students, is the fact that it has been a cold turkey for most of them, moving from face-to-face learning to online learning. They disconnect from their friends, the learning process itself. It's not the same than when they're in that community of themselves, that community of colleagues, and they can deal with different issues. And so you have children, you have young adults, you even have grown people, mature people experiencing these challenges. And I think one of the things that the pandemic has pointed out to is the need for more focus on the mental side, the mental aspect of our overall holistic development. Whether that is through sport, whether it is through taking into consideration the challenges that people are experiencing, and making sure that we approach life in a more holistic sense. And I think this is where sport can play an important role. As I said earlier on, one of the benefits for me is that, after I finish run, my endorphin levels rise so much. You are at a high at 7 o'clock in the night. That's so much so I struggle to sleep at nights. I mean, I'm up until 1 in the morning, because you're pumped. I almost start work again, and then that's a simple example of how you can deal with stress. A stress reliever, the social aspect of it. And so I think this is where sport can come in as well, and that whole community aspect of it, creating that environment so that people can be part of it across the different age groups, gender, religion, ethnicity, etc.
Mhm. And it's it's nothing new to the sportsmen. Well, some athletes in particular who have been at, especially U.S. colleges, they will tell you that the online learning aspect has been part of their routine over the years, especially when they participate in, on the road, as they will tell you that the lecturers will give them their lessons, and sometimes they're on the road for a week, 2 weeks, and that online learning aspect will be part. So the pandemic just cemented their position as folks who have been engaged in virtual learning for quite a period of time. But Doc, importantly also is the mental challenge that sportsmen and sportswomen would have faced during this pandemic. Lack of training, for example, and I know you touched on it briefly in in the earlier segment. But do you think that would have put a strain on some of the athletes? Although to an extent we are seeing some sporting activities now, we're now getting back to some sporting activities, some level of normalcy to an extent. Track and field for one. There's some football, cricket, albeit spectatorless, but there are some sports that have been probably blank for the last year and a half. How much of a mental challenge do you think that will have on those athletes themselves?
I think it will have, it definitely would have had and is having a great impact, negative impact on these athletes. And I'll give you a simple example. In 2019, 2020, we were supposed to have the regional women under 19 tournament to select the first ever West Indies under 19 team, girls team, to participate in the inaugural ICC under 19 Women's World Cup that was supposed to be played in Bangladesh in January of this year. And we had a number of players. I'm attached to one of the female clubs, in 3 clubs in Trinidad and Tobago. And we had, out of our club, about 6 or 7 players who were looking forward to first making the national team last year and then making the West Indies team to go to that inaugural World Cup. Some of them, that would have been their only chance because they would have been in that age area. Once they participated, this would have been their only World Cup. And then they were given that disappointment that, we couldn't have the tournament last year. And then there was the hope that the tournament would take place at the end of this year. So there was still that expectation that the World Cup will take place. And then recently, the ICC have announced that the tournament will now take place in January of 2023 in Bangladesh. And so in that process, a number of our players, and not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but throughout the Caribbean, chances of playing in on a 19 Girls World Cup in cricket would have just been destroyed. And it is not just the chance of playing, the fact that they may lose interest in continuing in the game, especially since women's cricket is at a nascent stage of development. And so, to answer your question, I'm giving you this example where that disappointment level would have been tremendous. And now that we have a lockdown, they cannot train, the minimal training. Now the coaches have been working with them to do online training, but there's no substitute for the real training. And so one of my major concern is that some of the progress that we have made in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm speaking also for the wider Caribbean, in terms of getting more females, young girls involved in women's cricket, that progress could be stumped. Um, and depending on when we do return, and we may lose players in the process, and getting new players may be a challenge as well. So that is a serious concern that we have. I mean, as part of my club, and I also sit on the national committee for women's cricket in Trinidad and Tobago, and that is also one of our major concerns. So when you break it down even by gender, you would find that women's sport could fall behind because of the pandemic, not only in the Caribbean, but in many other parts of the world, especially where the attempt now is to get more females involved in sport.
And young people in particular, the attention span, Doc. We know that the pandemic may have put a lot of folks, well, indoors for one, and to an extent closer to their electronic devices and these sorts of things. How do we break that pattern after all these months, to some extent a year and beyond? How do we break that pattern and try to get them back out in terms of physical activity, sports events, etc., etc.?
Well, I'm going to look at it look at it this way. I think the fact that they would be shut down for such a long period, I think they are waiting to exhale, and we just have to cash in on that. We just have to cash in on that. But at the same time, you are going to have a lot of competition for attention. The cinemas, the malls, the beaches. So yeah, I think the organizers will have to be creative to cash in on the fact that they want to socially exhale, but how do we get them to become part of what we are looking for? But I don't think it's going to be so much an issue in getting them to get involved in things. But unlike in the past, they have far more alternatives now to choose from. And it's how do we attract them back into sport and physical activity.
Okay, then. Thank you very much, Doc. I want to appreciate your presence on the program. And folks, if you can look out for Doc's weekly column in the Trinidad Guardian. The next one is due on Monday, God's willing. Monday.
Yes.
Right. Sportification. And the last column had to do with the whole issue of physical inactivity and severe COVID-19 outcomes. You can always check the Trinidad Guardian and read up on that aspect of it, the physical inactivity and severe COVID-19 outcomes, and look forward to his next column on Monday, God's willing, in the Trinidad Guardian. Doc, some final words from you?
I want to say thank you very much, Michael, for having me on your program. I think programs like these are very important. They reach a far large population. And what I would like to say as well is that even though we are in a lockdown in different forms and fashion throughout the region, we have to find ways to be physical activity. As we said earlier on, it doesn't have to be sport per se. Just keep ourselves active, raise the heart rate, sweat, walk the stairs as much as possible. Just keep mobile. And then when post period, we can then get involved in different activities such as walking if you don't want to run, cycling, bike, swimming, and other activities. And it is not just the benefit for the individual, but it can help in terms of family, seeing parents out there flying kites. All those things are physical activity. And so once we in the region can have a physically active population, it augurs well for the future. And we really want to encourage our younger people to become physical activity. active. We do not want them to be suffering from high blood pressure at a very early age or diabetes. Um, once it's not hereditary, we can prevent those things. And so we all have a responsibility for the next generation. So those will be my closing words, Michael.
Okay, then. Thank you very much, Doc, and all the best. I appreciate your presence. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, then. So, folks, that was Dr. Anand Rampersad. He's speaking to us live from Cuba in Trinidad, and he is a lecturer in sociology and behavioral science department at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine Campus. And very interesting discussion on the whole issue of physical inactivity and the outcomes of COVID-19. Again, on the surface, it seems to be just a simple topic, but when you get closer and you really think about it, you realize that it's very, very important topic and something that we will be speaking about in the future, because you raised some very important points. And it's a situation where you see, even here in New York, for example, that the folks are, as you say, waiting to exhale. The moment time they said that, parks are open, etc., open, thousands of people are flocking into the parks. And, obviously there's some sense of relief and people want to exhale and they want to get some, free time. And physical activity is one of those, as you indicated, that the marathons, for example, will be back in later in the year. The New York Marathon is one. I think the Boston Marathon is another. And all these things that people use for some means of physical activity. And it's not just sport as physical activity. It could be walking, hiking, swimming, as he indicated, using the stairs instead of the elevators, all these things. There are people who will, cycle to work instead of driving, and some, depending on their, how far they may walk to work, walk to school. Well, I used to walk to school in my days, All these things are some means of what you call physical activity, and no doubt something that will have to be taken serious. And as indicated, is not just a state responsibility. That was the important point he was making there. It's not just a state responsibility. There are various stakeholders who have, various, role to play in that thing. So, folks, that's our program for this evening. We'll be back on Saturday for the Saturday Sports Special from 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock will be our next program on Saturday. And then come next Thursday, another of the Talk Sports program from 8 o'clock in the evening. I want to thank you for being part of our program and do invite you to be with us come Saturday from 1 o'clock. Until then, have a pleasant evening.